what we want to do is to have a 1-hour debate on, the main topics of the book written by Pelle Dragsted from Denmark, and we'll get back to that in just a second. Before I move on, I'll hand over the microphone to my colleague Zlatko Jovanovic, and he'll briefly introduce you to the platform and how we use it during this meeting. So please, Zlatko.
Right. So, thank you, Rasmus. And as some of you may have noticed, I've just taken sound of you away from you. I've muted you, so in order to avoid any background noise. That doesn't mean that you won't be able to speak later. Once we go through presentation, you will be able to turn on your sound and pose your questions. And speaking of questions, during the presentation, you are more than welcome to send your questions in the chat. To me, you'll find my name, Zlatko Jovanovic, in the chat. If you are sitting by a computer, you will find the chat on the bottom bar in the middle of it. Then you click on the chat option and then choose my name. If you by chance sitting by an iPad, you'll find the chat function in the upper corner. There are 3 dots. And those dots, once you touch them, then you'll have a chat function opening up, and then you can also send your question to me. Then I'll note all the questions, and I'll ask you to pose your questions. However, if you don't want to directly ask the question, or if you don't have a mic on your computer, you are more than welcome to send the question to me and just let me know that you don't have a mic. Then I will read your question. And that way also it will be heard by our guests tonight. Also I can tell you one more thing. Lastly, that's that I will record this meeting, and I will do that so we can later share it on our YouTube channel, but also we'll try to make a podcast out of this. So that's all from me, and welcome.
Welcome to this debate meeting. It's hosted by us in DEO, that's Democracy in Europe organization. We are from Denmark, all of us, and we are working closely with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Brussels on this series of debates on the crisis, handling the crisis and democratizing the economy. And this is our first meeting in a series of meetings. And for this meeting, we take our point of departure from Pelle Dragsted. He's been working in Parliament as an advisor, an economic advisor to Enhedslisten, the Danish Red-Green Alliance. Later, he was elected to the Parliament and did 4 years as a member of Parliament. And for the last year and a half, a bit more, he's been working on different projects. He's an activist. He writes columns in a series of newspapers in Denmark, and just recently he came out with this book called Nordic Socialism towards a democratic economy or economic democracy. And Pelle, we're very happy to have you here today online. We'd like to have you live and be able to see you and speak to you afterwards as well, but we'll have to manage. So good of you to come, and we are looking forward to your presentation on some of the main sort of arguments and points in your book.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone, and thank you for taking your time, and thanks to DEO and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for making this event possible. I think it's really important that the left and radical left from Europe and internationally engage much more in common debates, cross-border debates, not least in these inspiring and interesting time where socialist ideas in some ways are gaining some momentum. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm looking forward to debate with you. So in the next 20-30 minutes, I will give you a brief and of course very superficial introduction to my newly published book, Nordic Socialism. And I will discuss how some of the ideas in the book can help us to understand and engage in what you could call maybe the political economy of COVID-19. So before I start, I would ask you to forgive my poor English skills. You'll have to be prepared for some elements of Danglish, but well, if you like me listen to guys like Piketty and Zizek, you would be used to funny accents. So I think we'll live with that. Well, I don't think that the more diagnostical part of my book will be of any surprise to the participants in this event. I expect that you're mostly left-wing socialist people. Of course, we don't know, but well, fundamentally, I describe capitalistic economy as unjust, unequal, as undemocratic, and as unsustainable. And these characteristics are not some kind of unintended or unlucky side effects of the economy. It's inherent in the very system, in the concentration of ownership and the commodification of production and exchange. Well, the concentration of ownership to our means of production, or corporation, finance, infrastructure, intellectual property, makes it possible for this, as you know, for this tiny elite of capital owners to acquire an unproportional part of the wealth created during the production process, thereby driving constantly inequality upwards. And that's bad enough because, as we know, unequal society are harmful to people and to our societies. But maybe even worse, the economic equality creates and increases inequality in political power and influence. The most obvious, of course, being this kind of direct support for parties and think tanks and media that defend and promotes elite interests. America is a very bad example of this kind of power of money. But actually, I think the most potent power stems from the very ownership of the apparatus of production and the ability to threaten governments and working classes to submission out of fear from losing investment and jobs. You know the drill. Every time that a government, left-wing government, is elected, we saw it with Podemos in Spain. The stock exchange go down. The international credit rating bureaus are in some kind punishing the governments who in any way threaten elite interests. In my book, I call this kind of power oligarchic power as opposite of the democratic power that should govern our societies. And I think that the growth during the neoliberal era of this oligarchic power at the expense of democratic power it does in some ways explain this crisis of democracy, phenomena like Trump and Boris Johnson, maybe even Orban. And I think that this oligarchic power is also one of the reasons for the unsustainability of the capitalist economy, because so many of the decisions that we take, for example, not least the direction of the investments, are taken by an unelected elite that externalize environmental and climatic destruction. Well, of course, as some social democrat would say, some of these negative consequences of capitalism can be mediated by different kind of regulations. For example, we can reduce inequality by post factum distribution via taxation. But that kind of regulation, or we can use carbon taxes, for example, to incentivize capitalists to act in a less harmful way. But the problem is that this kind of regulation and redistribution is getting harder to do. It's getting harder due to the growing oligarchic power. We have seen how the fossil industry lobby through decades succeeded in making it impossible for the states or for the European Union to create a quota system that really works, for example. And in the same way, we see taxes, corporate taxes going down. There are some positive elements right now, but during decades, we have seen the same kind of development. So therefore, my main conclusion in the book, one of the main conclusions is that we have to go to the root of the problem, which is this very concentration of ownership of the means of production of corporations and banks and productive enterprise. And that only by redistributing and democratizing ownership, we will be able to bypass and diminish the oligarchic power to reinvigorate democracy, and thereby giving the majority, the working class if you like, the power to solve the problems that we are facing at our time, being from climate change to the housing crisis to job insecurity. Yeah, I could continue in that way. So okay, that's a diagnosis, and I think none of that should be of any surprise to a socialist audience. What is maybe a bit more controversial in my book is that I argue that in some way socialism is already here, or at least important elements and experiences of socialism and democratic ownerships are already here. This may be a bit provocative statement is the reason for the book's title, Nordic Socialism, which is a term that I stole directly from an report and an analysis by Donald Trump's White House administration called The Opportunity Cost of Socialism. It was a report warning the Americans not to vote for Bernie Sanders and AOC and other American socialists. And they, as we know, has pointed to the Nordic countries and as some kind of inspiration for their democratic socialism. There was also, maybe some of you will be familiar with this Fox News anchor, Trish Regan, she got very famous, at least in Denmark, by making a really crazy statement about Denmark being, she was talking about this giant state, high taxes, free education, and she ended her statement saying, that's the reality of socialism. Well, my claim in the book is that Trump and Sanders and maybe Trish Regan are more right than we so far have acknowledged when they regard the Nordics as somewhat socialist. And that our inability to acknowledge this have been and is an important barrier for us to imagine and to argue for a socialist transformation. Of course, the Nordic countries aren't socialist economies, not at all, so far from. But I think to regard our economy as purely capitalist is, in my opinion, also misleading and maybe a quite lazy analysis of our economies. Capitalism, as I stated earlier, is defined by a system where a class of capitalists own the means of production, exploit wage labor, and exchange the products on a market. And if we take this definition seriously, a substantial part of our economy cannot be regarded as capitalist. In Denmark, the public sector constitutes around 20-25% of GDP. Around 1/3 of the working population is employed in this sector. And in the public sector, as you know, the means of production from hospitals to kindergartens, harbors, libraries, universities are not owned by capitalists, but by all of us. And the services that we produce are not sold on a market, but distributed freely and financed by a progressive tax system. In other words, according more or less to the socialist notion of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. If we look to other Nordic countries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland, we also have state ownership of important corporations, financial institutions, and financial assets on a major scale. But it isn't just in our public sector that we find common and democratic ownership. We have a long tradition also for cooperative ownership in the private sector as well. Our main chain of supermarkets or convenience stores, Coop, is owned by 1.8 million member owners that elects the leadership. There's no capital owners that make gains from the enterprise. If we look to our critical infrastructure, the lion's part is cooperatively owned, from water to heating to electricity. So no profit to capitalism, and also democratic governance in this sector. In our housing sector in Denmark, around 20% of the units are owned cooperatively. The rent is not set by the market, and no one profits from these houses. And the cooperative housing sector is governed democratically by a leadership elected by the tenant members. Even in the financial sector, we do have a substantial cooperatively owned sector, mutual banks and insurance, pension funds governed by workers, and etc. In Finland, we read today in Denmark that the biggest bank is cooperatively owned, and that's the reason for the Danish banks operating in Finland not to put negative yields on accounts of normal people, because they have competition for this kind of democratic or governed consumer-owned banking sector. And I could continue. In fact, you could go through a day in Copenhagen and almost only be in contact with cooperatively owned, democratically governed parts of the economy. So, in other words, capitalism or capitalist economy is without no doubt dominant in our economies, without no doubt, but it is not alone and it is not unchallenged. And I think this way of understanding our economy challenges in some way the usual way that we as socialists have described and understood capitalism as a totality covering the whole of the society and economy. We're always talking about living in a capitalist society, having a capitalist economy. And then socialism also seen as a new totality that will emerge only when capitalism is overcome. So a central idea in my book is to leave this idea of this binary between socialism and capitalism behind, and instead understand our economies as some kind of hybrids, where capitalism right now is dominant, but socialist and democratic modes of production is also present. And I show in my book how the capitalist and the democratic sector of the economy historically have competed. From the late 19th century, the cooperative sector colonized a substantial part of the economy. And after World War II, in the decades following, in the social democratic era, the public sector overtook and decommodified new important economic terrain. But in the neoliberal age, during the last 3 or 4 decades, we have seen the opposite development, a capitalist recolonization of the economy through privatization, market reforms, and demutualization of cooperative enterprises in Denmark, especially in the finance sector. Okay. So why is this way of understanding capitalism and socialism, in my opinion, important? Firstly, it converts socialism from a pure utopia in a distant future to something that is present and well-known and loved by many people, if we talk about, for example, our welfare services. And, you know, I'm sure if you have engaged in debates with right-wing pundits, you have been asked the question, where have socialism ever functioned? And our answer to that should be, well, right here. We can point to our own experiences. Every day we're witnessing that democratic governed enterprises are functioning without a tiny elite ownership hunting profits, and they're doing great. Well, in other words, socialism is not something that we have to create from scratch, and not something that we'll have to wait for until the total overthrow of capitalism. We already do have important building blocks to build from and to expand from. And the task, as I define it in the book now, is to turn the tide of the neoliberal age and start developing, expanding, and deepening the democratic and socialist part of the economy. And of course, and we could go further into detail about this, I'm not saying at all that this democratic sector is unproblematic. We have a lot of problems in the public sector. People do not feel, engaged, or all this kind of marketization where it may be publicly owned, but it's governed like private companies. Also in the cooperative sector, we have a lot of problems. But my argument in the book is that even besides these different problems, this sector is qualitatively different. And that's also my own experience from being in some of these companies, that their logics of how they act and how they take decisions are quite different from capitalist corporations. Well, in the later part of my book, on the ground of this understanding, I suggest a series of concrete reforms that could expand different types of common and democratic ownership. Goes from worker co-ops to cooperative and public banking, different kinds of what I call fund socialism, inspired by what we in Denmark called økonomisk demokrati. In Sweden, it was called løntagerfonde, as worker ownership funds. I discuss different types of common ownership of financial assets, and also new forms of democratic public ownership inspired by experiences throughout Europe. I also suggest reforms that would decommodify new sectors of the economy by, as we did in the decades after World War II, taking commodified areas out of the market and transforming them into social rights for the citizens. It could be public transport, internet access, medicine, etc. And finally, I propose to significantly expand democratic planning in the economy. Not the Soviet kind of planning that tried to plan the entirety of production from above, but a planning of the direction and the frameworks of the economy. I take some inspiration from Kate Raworth's idea of a donut economy. You know, that there are some between the boundaries of fulfilling the needs of people on one side and not crossing the borders of our resources on the other side. There's a kind of, you know, the donut space in the economy, and our democratic planning should make the economy work inside this donut. So an example from our Danish new experiences, the climate law that we passed 1.5 years ago, it sets a clear goal to reduce emissions by 70% in 2030, and it in some way decides that every government that is elected will have to fulfill this plan. Of course, right now we are fighting to get it fulfilled, but the idea that we take common democratic decisions on the directions of the economy, and then, well, if we can use market mechanism to achieve some of the goals, fine with me, I have no problem. But when the market mechanism cannot or working in opposite of what we want, of course, we have to make the more direct regulation or direct, like as an example, putting an end to the sale of fossil cars and vehicles. By expanding and deepening different forms of common ownership and democratic governance, we can fight this inherent problems of the capitalist economy, like inequality. But we also do fight the oligarchic power that follows from this inequality. So carrying through the reforms I suggest would significantly change power relation in our economy, strengthening democratic power at the expense of oligarchic power of the capitalist elite. So it would empower workers, democratizing the workplace, but also empower citizens and the democracy as such, and give the democracy the reins of the economy as a whole. So that is a very, very brief presentation of what I'm trying to say in my book. And I really know that it's superficial, and of course you have a lot of questions. And I promise you that in the book it is much more discussed and debated, and not this kind of a bit slogans or superficial statements. But okay, I have promised also to talk a bit about the COVID-19, because that's the issue of these debates. So So how can how can this view of capitalism and democratic transformation of the economy help us to understand what I call the political economy of COVID-19 and how to go forward as a left wing in this actuality that we're in right now? Well, first of all, I think the crisis have shown once again that what I call more socialist economies are doing far better than more capitalist economies. The pandemic have been a kind of comparative study, you could call it, on a world scale. We have faced the same pandemic, but the consequences have been varying a lot among countries. And the picture is quite clear. Countries with a decommodified public-owned healthcare system, for example, and with essential workers' rights, such as paid sick leave, have had far less deaths than more capitalist economy or more market-dominated economies. It goes beyond saying that a pandemic is harder to fight when people do not have access to healthcare or when they have to go to work sick to pay their rent. Well, secondly, we have seen, for example, in Sweden, how the privatization and commodification of public sector services like elderly care have had quite severe consequences for the spread of the pandemic among elders. Thirdly, we're also witnessing right now how the capitalist ownership of big pharma and of intellectual property right to vaccine treatment constitutes a major barrier for making vaccines available to all. A fact even more absurd because of the development of these vaccines in great extent have been publicly funded. Finally, we have seen how state intervention in the economy have been key in getting the economies, but also private businesses, more or less safe through the pandemic. In Denmark, as elsewhere, private corporations have been receiving billions in state support to survive this crisis. As we saw during the financial crisis, once again, we are collectivizing the losses of private companies during the crisis. And you can see all these facts are new, in my opinion, are new strong arguments in favor of more democratization of ownership and more decommodification of essential services. And the left, of course, should use this experience, the experience that people have right now, to put forward agendas of democratic ownership and decommodification. And I'll just give some few examples of what could be some of the proposal to bring forward, and that would be the last part of my presentation. Well, the comprehensive state support for businesses and banks during the pandemic is a strong argument for the state taking ownership stakes in the companies that receive the state support. Instead of just sending taxpayers money to big corporations, the financial assistance should take form of investment with the right to get a part of the capital dividends after the crisis have ended. Actually, that have happened in several European countries. In Denmark, we also succeeded in making the government create a fund to do this kind of state intervention investment. Until now, the fund hasn't used any of its money, but the idea was there. But it's very important that the ownership stake should be used actively to influence the businesses and its activities. It should not be this kind of a passive ownership, but a very active ownership. One example is a French initiative where the state supported the airline industry, but under the condition that they cancel the domestic airlines between cities where a decent train alternative exists. That's one example of putting this kind of conditions for support, but they should and could be expanded. Demands of unionization or curbing bonuses and indecent salaries for CEOs could be just some ideas of condition for getting this kind of state financial assistance or investment stakes. Secondly, we should also use the experience to demand a serious expansion of welfare services and social security in order to make our societies more robust to new crises and pandemic. We know this is not the last one we will face. And these should include rolling back a lot of the so-called labor market reforms that during the last decades have decimated the protection for working people. And this expansion of welfare and social security should be paid by, for example, windfall taxes on corporations and individuals that have profited from the crisis. The enormous gains on financial assets and real estate that we have seen during the last year is not a result of any kind of creative initiative or actions or even risk-taking by capitalists. It's just a direct result of central bank monetary policies that have driven up asset prices through, for example, this quantitative easing. So taxing these gains would be just logical. When the state support to businesses in the coming months is phased out during the months to come, many small and medium businesses will be threatened by bankruptcy because of the lack of liquidity, etc. Some of them all this talk about zombie companies or zombie corporation who are the economies even before the crisis was bad, but then through financial assistance from the state, they have survived. And we should create incentives for these businesses to give ownership stakes to their employees or to convert their businesses into worker co-ops. After the financial crisis, this kind of initiatives in, for example, France and Italy led to the creation of hundreds of new worker co-ops. And we should take this inspiration to the Nordics and Northern Europe. Finally, a central task for the left is to raise the demand, of course, of socializing vaccine development and production. That's the most obvious point. The existing model is a kind of a double taxation of the citizens. First, we pay to develop the vaccines through public research and public funding. And afterwards, we pay again to secure a big pharma this enormous profits. That's just crazy. So we should make sure that intellectual property rights to publicly financed inventions, for example, vaccines, but not only vaccines, are maintained and held by public institutions. That would also make it possible for us to share the vaccines with the global south instead of this terrible vaccine apartheid that we are experiencing right now. And we should also build, or then in the Danish case, rebuild state-owned production facilities for vaccines and medicine. Well, all this kind of what I call socialist reforms or democratic reforms would not only make our societies stronger and more resilient in times of crisis and pandemic, they would also strengthen the democratic power at the expense of oligarchic power that govern our economies today. And that's exactly what Nordic socialism is all about. So that would be my introduction. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Pelle. And we are ready to take your questions and comments, but please keep them rather brief so we get like one question from each of you and we can get the debate rolling. And we have one question pending from Daniel Sestracic. Is that right? Please turn on your phone or your microphone and let us hear.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pelle, also. Really nice to listen to you. I have a question about, I understand your idea to make socialism viable and not an utopian idea that couldn't be reached in our lifetime, for example. But I can't help to think, and I am not sure of the answer of this, that we are maybe, by calling the things that are publicly owned as socialism, but while it's ruling on capitalist rule more and more and by capitalist principles, will we not blockade, at least for the idea about how to understand for ourselves and how to broaden the debate about how socialism could look like in the Nordic countries, for example? And the second thing inside of that, because I think that your framework is working when you are connecting and saying more like, this is socialist seeds maybe, and it's working with your ideas that comes afterwards. And when you're saying we need to do this, 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 and this, because that's clear for me. But do you understand my question? Couldn't this be instead of a liberation of the thought and what we could do in our countries, more of a blockage, both for us and for the public? Because if we say to the public, this is socialism, the healthcare, the schools and so on, that is not working especially well, at least not in Sweden, they would say, what? Is this socialist? Is this democratically owned? Because it's on a such superficial level that it's not felt as the solution and the dream about socialism that we need, that also needs to be a reality. Do you understand how I'm thinking around this?
Yes.
This would be my question.
Actually, two good questions. Is the formal ownership of, for example, a company, is that enough to sort of thwart the logic of capitalism? And like you pointed to, some of the financial institutions that are owned by consumers, they still operate on a capitalist logic. So that's the first part of the question.
Yeah, should I take that
Yes,
now?
please. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's really an important discussion about this utopian power, or the power of utopia also, because of course the idea of this socialist utopia in some way have been very engaging for generations of socialists, also making people ready to sacrifice a lot of their time and maybe their life for changing society. But in some way, I think that it's also a kind of an abstraction, because I think a lot of the problems that we are seeing today in cooperatives or in our public sector, the same kind of problems would emerge in a socialist society. It have to do with maintaining democracy generation after generation. You know, when the cooperative was in Denmark was started, for example, our brugsforeninger, our convenience stores, people will in the first maybe 10, 20, 30 years were very engaged, and it was a democratic enterprise. And then, you know, all kinds of institutions in some way, they institutionalize. So the democratic spirit and engagement in some way goes away, because, you know, you get used to this as an institution and not as something created by people. And I think this is really something that also would be a challenge in what we see as this pure socialist society. I have, for example, thought about if you and I, Daniel, should create, we made the socialist revolution yesterday, and now we should organize this kind of national network of convenience stores. So we should make the founding papers of this new and how to organize them. I think that what we would end in would be quite close to the document, what do you call it, vedtægter, to the
articles of association.
The articles of co-op, because, you know, they have this local democracy in every store combined with the national democracy. They have this board of representatives that chooses the board that employs the leaders, and, you know, also the employees have some representation. So in some way, it's very easy to criticize my the existing socialism, real existing socialism, by comparing it to a socialist utopia. But I just don't think that this utopia exists. But of course, you are right that we should be very clear that these, what I call democratic sector companies, if they're cooperatively owned or publicly owned, are not in any way perfect, or in any way the way that we would like to organize these companies. And we should make that very clear. And in a large extent, what have gone wrong is the capitalist influence in these kind of companies. So maybe you're right to call it seeds or germs, or this kind of vocabulary maybe would be better. But I think we should also think about socialism not being some kind of messianistic idea about this kind of post-political, post-conflictual society. But of course, the idea of this final liberation of humankind is a strong idea. It's also a problematic idea, I think, that in maybe have some seeds of totalitarianism when it goes in worst possible ways. But it's really an interesting question, Daniel, and I thought a lot about it while writing the book, because this balance between, you know, being practical and this almost social engineering ideas of my book, and then this you know, one Danish writer was criticizing my book because he said it didn't make him want to dance. He compared Rosa Luxemburg to Emma Goldman, but we forget about that. But it was not, you know, this kind of liberation. It's also a criticism that other comrades from our party have spoken. So I think it's maybe you're right that we have to find a better balance between this utopian notion of this totally different society, but still showing that it is in fact possible to have effective economic enterprise to produce wealth and livelihood in ways without having this kind of greed and capitalism and undemocratic governance.
We have another question from Jon Hornqvist. Please turn on your microphone, Jon.
Yes. Hi. Thanks. Sorry, I have this medal. Just happened to be my birthday, so my kids gave me this medal today. I guess that's why you put the seminar. Yeah, the thing I want to say is thanks for writing this book. I think it's really so important and crucial that people like take these kind of debates and bringing up front. And I work for the Swedish Left Party, and I think the way that we have been working on trying to conceptualize the socialism, it's not so strange. It is something that we want to, that is much better, but it's not totally, it's that a lot of things that we like the most in the welfare state comes from socialist ideas. So I think that is a really strong point. The thing that I would like to ask about is the question of strategy that I think you did not maybe talk so much about, because I think like most of the ideas you brought up now, I think they are good and they are strong and they make sense if you talk to people. Like, why shouldn't we also do this in this sector? Why should the banks be weaker? People say, yeah, it's good, it's nice. But those are the ideas that have been around for such a long time. And it's always like when you go to an election campaign or when it's never the things that really put people on fire. So it's always put to the side. And I think that says something that we need to figure out what are the most strategic ones of these questions. Like I tend to always nag about, like, I think maybe the bank going after the banks because they're such influential players, and even more in Sweden than Denmark, because you actually have somewhat publicly owned banks. We don't really. But those kind of questions, like which are the ones that could actually turn the table, because you could show that if we change public ownership in this sector, we can actually move things forward. We can, for example, we have all these cooperative companies, but they act like capitalist ones because they are in the hands or in the claws of capitalist institutions. Like, what are if you would take a strategy, which are the most important things to move on here, which will make people go from like nice till, yeah, that's what we should do.
So how do we turn good ideas into mobilization? I saw a recent survey that good science, they don't get a lot of publicity on good science. It's surprising conclusions in a specific study that gets all the public sort of attention. So how do you move from good ideas to mobilization and strategy?
Well, I think maybe it's not, and happy birthday, John. I think maybe it's not. I'm not totally agreeing on that. These issues are not, hot in the political agenda during elections, but mostly they have been contested when we are on the defensive. In Venstrepartiet, for example, you have the issue of Vinst in welfare have been a central part of your electoral campaigns for many years, and that's exactly a battle around democratic ownership against private corporate logics and in commodification against decommodification. In Denmark, we have, during the last 10 years, have a lot of this kind of confrontations around privatization of our energy sector, dong, as some Danish people will remember, where a lot of people have been mobilized. So in some way, I think that the people, broadly speaking, have this notion, there's some kind of maybe unconscious notion of knowing that democratically held companies are valuable. We don't want them to be privatized. And for me, going back to maybe what Daniel was asking, that's a kind of a proof, that if everything just was capitalism, why would it be so important for us? Why do we feel so strongly against privatization? It's because we, in some way, and the people have this notion that maybe the public ownership or cooperatively ownership is not perfect, but it has potential for democratic governance. That we know that when our cooperative bank are bought up by one of the corporate banks, or when our energy sector is sold out, that we lose some kind of influence and power, and people know that. And so the question is, how do we go from the defensive to the offensive? How do we start to expand democratic ownership into new sectors? And that's, I think, is a crucial question. I think it differs maybe from country to country. We've seen the Corbyn campaign, for example, campaigning for internet and Wi-Fi access as a social right. That could be one point. Expanding the cooperative housing sectors will be a very hot discussion during the municipal elections in Denmark, at least in the capital in some month. Right in the last budget negotiation in Denmark, we succeeded in getting, we formed an expert group that should deliver ideas on how to help grow more cooperative businesses. So it's a lot of different ways, and of course, and that's of course the problem of all kind of socialist ideas, that if we really want to, for example, democratize our workplaces, if we really want to democratize ownership of the workplace among workers, the initiatives should come from the working class and their organizations. As in fact, the discussion of Löntagarfond in Sweden did. It was a broad discussion. Maybe some of the present here, if there are people who can remember, they will be able to tell about this experience. Of course, it was blocked by elite interests and modified by social democrats. So it ended in I think Rudolf Meitner, who was the architect, called it en ynkelig rot, altså a pity rat in the way it was constructed in the end. But I think the ideas of engaging trade unions and in discussions about how to engage in democratization and getting access to the dividends of the value they're creating themselves is, of course, crucial. But I admit that my book isn't. It's not this part of my book, the strategic part of how to form these coalitions and this historical block, if you might, that could lead to this transformation. I'm not solving that riddle in my book. Unfortunately, there will have to be a second edition. Maybe John, you could write that.
We have a question from Karen Helvig Petersen. And after that, Kai Thor will take the 2 questions.
Yeah.
So Karen, if you could...
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it is a long discussion, but I have a new question for you. Namely, that you never mention money. For me, money is a kit of capitalism. This is a distributional kit. This is also how we determine our daily consumption and so on and so forth. So when and if I go with the flow of your thinking now, when and if we can, all these things will be more or less democratically organized, then you will also have to make more decisions on how to distribute, how the distribution of the rest of commodities and their organization will have to be made, and will this monetary mechanism not eventually have to be abandoned, and how will that be? I mean, in my perception, socialism, communism is a system that functions without this money. And for you accept it. You want to sort of socialize money or look to a way of making it more democratic. But money as it is not democratic. And it seems to me that it will always continue not to be democratic as long as we have capitalist companies and the drive of capitalism to produce ever more surplus value accumulation and so on and so forth. How will you kill the capitalist drive? That's the question.
And that's a good question, Karen. Do you have an answer to that, Pelle? So let's just take a Kai Thor's question as well. So you have 2 things at once.
Oh yes, that's another thing. Looking at the people's reactions during the COVID crisis, the demand for traveling and physical meetings and things like that, a crisis which has lasted 1 year and 3 months. How do you see the possibilities for the support of the people for the next 30 years to reach the CO2 neutrality in 2050?
Did you get that question, Pelle?
If when they are so much resistant to just these small attacks, or what you call it, on individual freedom, that the cost of
the experience during the COVID crisis, the possibility to do some restrictions, but meeting some resistance as well. How does that bode for tackling the climate crisis? There's 2 big questions. I hope you.
Yeah. Well, Karen, the issue of money is, is really complicated in many ways, and I have read a lot of books about money, and in some ways, for each book I read, I get more confused. I have no problem in the dream of the idea of the utopia of a moneyless society. For me, it's very hard to imagine how it in reality would function, how we would govern enterprise, how we would secure allocation of production. And I think the few experiments that have been done in this direction haven't been very successful. But what I'm writing in my book is that what I propose in no way is blocking more radical ideas or a future radical development into a moneyless communist economy. On the opposite, I think if you carried through my program of socialist reforms, we would get a lot of experiences in how to organize economic enterprise in democratic ways, how to plan important parts of the economy, and maybe in that during that experience we will be able to find and see new to acknowledge that it could be possible to take these new steps. But I think if we really want to win over people today about going against this oligarchic power, transforming ownership, democratizing and distributing ownership, we shouldn't start with claiming to abolish money, for example. I think it is so abstract and so hard for people to understand. And I think that if you really want to argue for radical changes, you know, in countries like the Nordics, we, in some way, we have to give answers to these logical questions as to, okay, so if you don't want market mechanism at all, how should we allocate livelihood and production and goods? And if the answer is, oh, we will make this kind of centralized planning, then we'll have to explain why it should function better this time than the last 60 years of experience during the Soviet era. But more narrowly about money, I think what is important is to take away the power of banks to create and to gain from in Danish you call it møntning. I don't know what you call it in English, but to create money. You should take a lot of that power back to public institution and to the central banks. And the central banks, of course, should be democratized. This fails autonomy that they're talking about today should be taken away, and the mandate of the central bank should be changed. I think, for example, it's obvious that that this is discussed right now in the British central bank, for example, and other places, the Swedish central banks as well. If you should have this kind of digital central bank currency, and if we do that, it would also make the central bank able to make monetary policies that would not create these very unequal results as the quantitative easing have done. For example, this kind of helicopter money, creating money and giving them to the people in order to during crisis to make some kind of economic activity. But you should have a discussion only around money during this, because there's a lot of interesting thoughts going around right now on this issue.
Pelle, we have 2 more questions, and I think we'll try and take them, if you can promise to keep them brief. We have a question from Bora Skold and Hans Henrik Olsen. So Bora Skold, if you please turn on your microphone and give us a brief question.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So it's hard to keep it brief, but I'll try. It's about the financial markets and how every person or public institution that invests money today invests it in stocks of different kinds or bonds. And the only reason is to make a profit. Now, these bonds and stocks are in big businesses. And so since their owners, us or public institutions, only incentive is to increase their profits, then that makes the businesses, which are like the biggest businesses in the world, their only aim will be to increase profit, not to save the environment, not to do anything else. So we're completely out of control of this. How can we transform this or stop this?
That's a good brief question on the financial world and mechanisms. I like that. Let's add a question from Hans Henrik Olsen.
Yes, I'll join up about which role you think the EU institutions and the European trade unions could have in supporting your thoughts in the of making changes. The trade unions are very thinking about pay rise campaigns and engaging movements about that. But the main question about the power, democratic ownership is not a matter that are discussing. Do you think there are any possibilities to use the EU institutions and regulations to support collective democratic ownership as a matter of power over capital created through labor. Do you think there's any possibilities to use the EU and the institutions and trade unions in that sense?
That's an interesting question as well. Do we have some perspective on a European scale or level? We need to round up after those two questions, so you keep it as brief as you can.
Okay, I will.
We'll have to engage in new means to solve them.
I think the EU is both a part of the problem, but could also be a part of the solution. For example, the free movement of capital was created by the EU. The most extreme form of free movement of capital in the world is inside the internal market. So in some way, when some people say, "Oh, we have to use the EU to take control of this," it's like people are forgetting that the EU was creating a lot of the problems from the very start. But on the other hand, of course, today EU is an institution, and an institution that we will have to use in order to try to roll back some of these, take back power to nation states in one way, for example, by doing it more easy for us to control capital flows. But on the other hand, we also need international regulation, and not least when we talk about climate. But of course, also some of the proposals that I am putting forward, for example, the ideas of giving workers majority ownership in big companies. It would be very difficult for one European country, not least a small country like Denmark, to carry forward these ideas. Of course, that would create capital flight, etc. So you would need some what do you call it? That the same would happen in several countries at the same time. That, of course, to make that possible, we'll have to organize across borders, but also to use the institution that we have on hand, and that the EU is one of them. Actually, I think it's quite interesting, this new proposals from the commissions about the governance of companies that have been creating this kind of big reaction from at least the Danish Employers Association and the Danish Industry Federation, because the Commission have dared to talk about that maybe other stakeholders and the capital owners should have some kind of influence on the business boards, like workers or local communities. So I'm sure that before this proposal are concluded, it will be watered down to nothing. But it's very interesting that we see the EU in this kind of going really against the interests of the governing class in this particular case. I'm not very optimistic about it getting an agreement on this point, but it is interesting, and it shows that the idea of the EU just being a tool in the hands of the elite is not an accurate description. Although that the structures and the treaties of the EU, of course, is favoring elite interests. That's obvious. But I think that all institutions and all are also always kind of they are decided by the class, the relation of forces among classes in the societies around them, and that also goes for the EU. Well, about the financial markets, of course in future Nordic socialism or democratic socialism, we shouldn't have financial markets in the way we have today. Of course, we should still have investments, because there would still be new ideas, new companies emerging that need capital in order to carry through their operations. But it shouldn't be this kind of marketized way of allocating investments in the way that we know today. I think that the public investment bank should play a major role, saying, that democratic decisions should be governing the direction of investment. And, the fact is that I think if we do not have growth or exponential growth in the future, and I think we all agree that that will not be possible forever in a finite world of resources, then capitalism will have to end, because the driving force of investment and capital accumulation in capitalism is you have money, you invest them, and you have a dividend or a surplus. But in a growth-less world, or in a world with very low growth, you cannot have the expectations, and therefore we'll have to find another way of allocating investments in capital in order to, in any way, if we're socialist or if we're not socialist, in some near or more maybe distant future, we'll have to find out how to allocate capital and investment in a new way, because we will not be able to continue with this kind of growth that we have experienced during the last 150 years. It's a short period of the history of human kind, and it will not be able to continue. But this is really I discuss it a little bit in the book, but speaking more narrowly of democratic ownership, I think the financial sector is very important, and in my book I discuss the ownership structures in the financial sector, central bank, but basically I think the idea is to democratize decisions of investment in different ways.
I think this will be the last words for in the debate today. We've promised to end 6 minutes ago, but I would like everybody here to do the famous Zoom clap that we do in DEO. That means you all turn on your microphones and clap. It doesn't sound well, but it's clapping. That's a roaring applause, Pelle. If they're all here.
Yeah. And I would love to be with you, and I should say that my book, if the Swedish comments have interest, will be published in Swedish in November from the publisher Verbal Forlag. So you'll be able to read it and criticize it and build from it, write an alternative vision of socialism, so we can continue this very important debate among comrades.
The English edition?
I hope so. I'm working on it.
Yeah, great stuff.
We'll look into it. And anyway, we'll continue this series of debates with new speakers and debate themes, and we'll announce it for you. You book this presentation, this debate with your email, so we'll get back in touch with you in the coming weeks. Thanks a lot, Pelle, for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
And thanks a lot for the book. It's very interesting to read, I find.